Welcome to season 2, episode 19, Adoption Misconceptions. I wanted to thank you so much for sticking with the show. I know I have not been here for a couple of weeks. We had Hurricane Beryl tear through Houston, so that knocked our power out for about 9 days. Couldn't work because my office didn't have power for over a week as well. And then I went out of town, which was fun. I went to a conference in Chicago, and I got to connect with some family, so that was really awesome. But yeah, it slowed down my ability to do some podcast episodes. But I am back, and I want to thank you so much for listening and watching if you're watching me on YouTube. But I did want to remind you before I get into the episode that I would love to have you on my email list. So if you would kindly visit www.faithful-futures.com, you can join my email list and learn more about the work that I do coaching parents, especially adoptive parents. But I also can do all kinds of parent coaching to help you out because it is not easy being a parent. I would know. I have 3 boys. So yeah, and also if you would love to get support from other Christian adoptive moms, I do have a Facebook group. It's called Christian Adoptive Moms Support Group. So if you go to my website, there's a link there for that Facebook group. We would love to have you. Now I just want to get into some misconceptions I personally had about adoption, and I would bet that many other people have these misconceptions as well. So, going back in time, my very first encounter was with adoption. My mom worked for a doctor all through me growing up. She worked for a doctor, and the doctor had 2 adopted children. One was a boy and one was a girl. And I remember my mom telling me that, oh my gosh, the son, he's in so much trouble. He's really, not behaving, and they had to send him to military school. And it turns out eventually that son became estranged from the family, and I don't think they ever had any contact again. As far as I know, the adopted daughter, did just fine and had a healthy, quote unquote, normal life. So that was my first encounter with adoption. And then I remember my mom talking about how, gosh, I don't think I could ever adopt a child because it's just so risky. You just don't know how they're going to turn out. So, later on, when I learned more about adoption, I realized that, well, you never really know what your child is going to turn out like, even if it's a biological child. So, there's that. There's always a little bit of uncertainty with parenting. But I guess, learning from that situation, I guess I thought before I got trained on adoption that, maybe it is risky to adopt a child. Maybe there are more, maybe the likelihood is more that a child will end up with problems, like my mom thought. So anyway, that was my first encounter with adoption. So then, as I'm getting older, I was in my 20s and I met this beautiful girl, and we had a lot in common. We liked a lot of the same music, and she told me she was adopted. And despite being adopted, she had a very, very strong attachment and like spiritual bond with her adoptive grandmother. So I thought, blood doesn't necessarily mean an adopted child can't bond and have a very, very close, healthy, loving relationship with somebody in their lives, just because that's an adoptive relationship. So I thought that was pretty cool. That made me feel like, okay, so maybe, it's not a bad idea for people to adopt. Maybe it's not as risky as I once thought it was. So that was my kind of second encounter with adoption. And then, of course, I meet someone else, another woman who was adopted. And, she has been struggling with severe mental illness and substance abuse almost her entire adult life. So that, again, made me worry. I'm like, but is it about the adoption? I mean, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. And then, as a teacher, I had, several adopted students and a few foster children as well. But I'll never forget, I had one student who had a very dedicated and involved foster mom. And the little girl was yearning for her biological mom. No matter how much the foster mom did for her, the little girl was struggling with some pretty serious mental health issues, but was always yearning for her biological mom. And I just thought, why is that? When this foster mom is doing everything for this child and, the biological mom has legal and substance abuse issues, that sounds like the worst thing for this child. Why in the world would this child want to be with a biological mother like that? And now that I've been trained on working with adopted children and their families, I know that having a relationship with any part of the biological family is actually a good thing and can be a very healthy and healing thing for an adopted child. Now, of course, the adoptive parents would have to make sure it's a safe relationship, and that, the biological, family isn't going to hurt the child or harm the child in any way. But research shows that when adopted children have some connection to their biological family, they end up doing a lot better. And this is because, adopted children grow up not knowing where they came from or who they are biologically. They don't know about their culture necessarily, unless their adoptive parents are the same culture or have, really taking great pains to teach the child about their culture. But many times an adopted child doesn't know about their culture, about, maybe the religion and the practices, the race. They just don't know this about their biological family. So it makes them very curious, but also makes them feel like they don't know who they are and that they must be missing something in their lives. So I learned something, very recently in my training about working with adoptive families, that no, it is a good thing for adopted children to have some sort of connection to their biological family. Now, it's up to the adoptive parents when that happens. A lot of adoptive parents say, the child can wait till they're 18 when they're an adult, a legal adult, and they can make the decision at that point to seek their biological family. But of course, like many of you probably have open adoptions where from the very beginning, the child has known about their biological family, and the biological family, might get pictures and letters from the child and may even get visits and things like that. So I do know now that having that connection to the biological family is actually really healthy and can be a very, very good thing for an adoptive child. So one thing that I really was a big misconception, and I might have talked about this in one of my previous episodes, but, I've been a therapist for several years, and I had a couple of clients who were adopted children, and they were both adolescents, and they were both adopted by parents that were a different race from them at birth. They were both, adopted at birth. And I thought, my misconception was, well, if the child is adopted at birth, then, there's no adoption problems here. Whatever they're dealing with has something to do with, parenting, or, maybe there's some, mental illness in their biological family. But I never, ever addressed the adoption. And even children that were adopted at birth have trauma. I learned that even just the separation from the child from the biological mother is traumatic. And the children hold on to that trauma in their bodies, in their minds, in their emotions. And a lot of times these kids are struggling because of the adoption, because of the they call it ambiguous grief. They're grieving for a family that they've never met or that they've never known, and there's no closure to it because they know that they have a family out there somewhere, and they have no way of meeting that family or satisfying that curiosity. Now, of course, like I just said, this is not for every adopted kid, because some adopted kids do know their biological family or have some contact with them. But in these cases with my clients, they did not have relationships with their biological family. So a lot of their problems were not getting better when they were working with me because I mistakenly never addressed their adoption. And that's key. And, a lot of you, you're very experienced adoptive parents and you do know these things, but those of you that are maybe curious about adoption or maybe have just adopted a child and maybe you weren't prepared with a lot of training that some adoption agencies provide, I just want you to know that the adoption does need to be addressed. Now, that doesn't mean that every child that's adopted is going to have mental illness, is going to have terrible problems like I thought when I had first encountered adoption. But it's important that you don't take the adoption out of the equation. If a child, let's say the child is struggling in school to pay attention and you as a parent think they might have ADHD, well, that's true. The child could have legitimate ADHD, but there also could be some trauma component to it. Some of, the depression and anxiety and ADHD that we see in kids today, it may be connected to the adoption, even if the child doesn't ever verbalize that, even if you've never really talked about the adoption as far as it causing any kinds of these problems with their kid, with your child. So just understand that the adoption may very well be a part of what's going on with the child. Any kind of depression or anxiety or, ODD, opposition, defiance, that can really come out during adolescence. It may come out in a bigger way once the kid understands what adoption really means and how that affects their identity or lack of an identity, how it affects their friendships, how they feel different moving through the world. They may be a different race, like I said earlier, than their parents and their siblings. So it's a hard thing for some adopted kids. And so just understand that it is a traumatic thing just to be separated from the biological mother. So those misconceptions, I'm so glad that I don't have them anymore. I understand a whole lot more about the needs of adopted kids and the needs that adoptive families have. So I just wanted to share those misconceptions with you and maybe dispel, if you had some of them, I wanted to dispel those for you. But that's really all I had today, just talking about my own personal misconceptions and what I've learned since I've been trained. And I just want to thank y'all so much for whether you've adopted or not, just having the curiosity about adoption. And, I just think it's a beautiful thing. And, I applaud you for answering the call to adopt. Jesus loves you, and so do I.